The moment I walked into the members' meeting room at that suburban golf club, I knew this wasn't the family catch-up my mom had texted about. There were no menus, no water glasses, just a printed agreement laid out neatly, a pen placed right where my hand would land, and a lawyer I'd never met already waiting. I looked around, counted the people in the room, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't a conversation. It was a transaction. If you've ever been called independent right before someone asked you to give something up, stay with me, like, share, and subscribe. You'll want to hear how this ended. They called it a family meeting. That was the phrase my mom used. Soft, familiar, harmless. At the time, my life didn't look dramatic. I worked remotely, mostly alone, laptop on the kitchen table, notes in a small notebook I carried everywhere. I lived in a one-story house near the highway, the kind of place you choose when you want things simple and predictable. I liked systems, lists, timelines. If something mattered, I wrote it down. If something felt off, I slowed down. That habit came from years of having to figure things out on my own. From the outside, people would probably say I had it together. Independent, self-sufficient, doing fine. That label follows you. And when people think you're fine, they assume you'll bend. They assume you'll keep the peace, because you've been keeping the peace your whole life. The invitation came wrapped in that same tone, nothing urgent, nothing threatening, just a message about catching up, about family, about doing the right thing together. Words like fair and reasonable showed up early. That's usually a sign, because pressure rarely starts loud, it starts polite. The most effective demands don't sound like demands at all. They sound like concern. They sound like guidance. They sound like love, adjusted just enough to make you doubt yourself. They make you feel childish for asking questions, guilty for wanting clarity. No one says, "We're here to take something from you." They say, "We just want to talk." No one says, "You don't have a choice." They say, "We hope you'll understand." Family becomes a moral shortcut, a way to skip consent, a way to make boundaries sound like betrayal. When someone says, "We're family," what they sometimes mean is, you're not allowed to say no. I felt uneasy, but I also knew how it looks if you don't show up. If you don't go, you're accused of avoiding, of being cold. So I went, not because I planned to agree, but because I wanted to see how far the soft language would go before it turned sharp. There's a moment early in these conversations where everything is coded in politeness. Smiles last a little too long. Voices stay low. No one names what they actually want yet. That's the moment they're testing you. They watch how quickly you apologize, how often you explain yourself, how fast you volunteer information to smooth things over. I'd seen the pattern in my family for years. The soft words always came dressed up as respect. They came with reminders of who sacrificed, who deserved gratitude, who had been left out. Same message, different packaging. What made this invitation different was how staged it felt. The location wasn't casual, the timing wasn't accidental, the meeting wasn't spontaneous. It felt prepared, like they'd been waiting for the moment I'd be tired enough to say yes. That's when I understood something important. This wasn't about connection, it was about leverage. And leverage works best when the other person feels obligated to be nice. I'm going to tell you why I still walked into that room. And I'm going to tell you why. Even though I looked alone, I wasn't. Because I didn't walk in expecting comfort. I walked in expecting a test. And I brought one thing with me that doesn't show up in group texts or holiday photos. I brought a boundary, quiet, firm, non-negotiable. My notebook sat in my bag like it always did. Not because I'm paranoid, but because I've learned that memories get rewritten when money enters the room. People swear they never said that. They insist you misunderstood. So I started keeping facts the way my dad taught me dates, names, exact phrases. I didn't plan on arguing. I planned on documenting. And I planned on having one person on standby, someone who wouldn't be moved by guilt, only by reality today. If you've ever been pulled into a talk that already had a script, if you've ever heard gentle words used like a rope, if you've ever been told you're independent right before someone asked you to give something up, then you already know what I mean. For now, just know this: when I stepped into that room, I wasn't confused. I was listening for the moment the politeness cracked. Because when it cracks, people stop acting like family. They start acting like creditors. And the first real ask came faster than I thought. The message came 2 days after the funeral. Short, casual. It said we should meet at the golf club and talk things through as a family. That was it. No subject line, no explanation. Just that phrase again. Family meeting. I remember staring at my phone longer than I needed to, long enough to feel that familiar pressure settle in my chest, the one that shows up before you even know what you're being asked for. Part of me already knew something was off. The timing felt wrong. The place felt deliberate. And I noticed how carefully the words were chosen. Nothing written down that could be quoted later. Nothing concrete enough to push back on. Still, I didn't reply right away. I opened my notebook instead. I wrote the date, the time, the location. I wrote down exactly how the message made me feel. Uneasy, alert, tired. That probably sounds dramatic, but it wasn't new. It was a habit I learned early. When you grow up in a family where boundaries blur easily, you learn to track your reality before someone else rewrites it for you. I questioned myself the way I always did. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe they just want closure. Maybe I should give them the benefit of the doubt. That's the reflex. You don't doubt because you're naive. You doubt because you were trained to doubt yourself before you ever doubted them. I'd been taught that keeping the peace mattered more than being comfortable. That asking too many questions made things awkward. That saying no, especially without a long explanation, was rude. So when something felt wrong, my first instinct wasn't to leave. It was to explain, to soften, to show up and be reasonable. That's how the meeting happened. I didn't go because I thought I would agree. I went because I didn't want to be accused of refusing to listen, because I knew how quickly silence could be used against me. If you don't show up, you're difficult. If you do show up and hesitate, you're selfish. Either way, the narrative isn't yours. I wanted to hear what they would say when everyone was in the same room. I wanted to see who spoke first, who avoided eye contact, who kept checking the paperwork before it was even mentioned. And yes, I wanted to know how far the politeness would stretch before it snapped. What people don't understand is that manipulation doesn't start with lies. It starts with tone, with implication, with phrases that make you feel unreasonable for needing clarity. They don't say, "We expect you to give this up." They say, "We just want what's fair." They don't say, "You don't have a choice." They say, "This would mean a lot to everyone." If you've never been in that position, it's easy to say you'd walk away. It's easy to imagine yourself shutting it down immediately. But when it's family, the cost of leaving isn't just the argument. It's the story they tell about you afterward. I knew that story well. So I went in prepared, but quiet. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't plan to convince anyone. I planned to observe. I planned to listen for what wasn't said yet. I also planned for the possibility that things would turn, because they usually do. Soft language only lasts as long as it's working. That's the part people miss. The reason many of us walk into rooms we don't trust isn't weakness. It's conditioning. We're not lacking logic. We're lacking permission. Permission to doubt. Permission to pause. Permission to say, something about this doesn't feel right, without being labeled dramatic. I didn't need more information. I already had enough. What I needed was confirmation. Confirmation that my instincts weren't exaggerating. And I got it. But not right away. At first, everything sounded reasonable. Everyone smiled. Everyone used careful words. The room stayed calm longer than I expected, which is exactly how I knew it was coming. I want to be clear about something. Walking into that room wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, a calculated one, because sometimes the only way to fully step out of a pattern is to see it play out one last time with your eyes open. Sometimes you don't walk in to negotiate. You walk in to collect clarity. I didn't know yet how quickly things would escalate. I didn't know who would speak first or how fast the tone would shift. But I did know this. I wasn't there to be persuaded. I wasn't there to be convinced. And I wasn't there to explain myself. I was there to decide whether this was still a conversation or whether it had already become something else. That answer came sooner than I expected. And once it did, I stopped wondering why I had shown up. I understood exactly why. When I think back to my teenage years, the difference between my parents was always clear, even before I knew how to put it into words. My dad, Thomas, lived by structure, not the loud kind. The quiet kind that shows up every day whether anyone notices or not. He paid bills early. He kept folders labeled by year. He wrote things down. If something mattered, it existed on paper somewhere, not because he didn't trust people, but because he understood how easily memories change when pressure shows up. He taught me that self-respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you practiced. You showed up on time. You kept records. You didn't rush decisions just to make someone else comfortable. When I was a teenager, he gave me my first notebook. Nothing fancy, just lined pages. He told me, if you don't write it down, someone else will tell the story for you. I didn't fully understand that then, but I kept the habit. My mom, Linda, cared about a different kind of order, appearances, the way things looked from the outside. She liked the right neighborhoods, the right schools, the right kind of life, the kind you could explain quickly to strangers. She liked saying I was mature, independent, responsible. You're old enough to handle it. She would say, you're smart. You'll figure it out. It sounded like praise. And at first, I took it that way. But over time, I noticed something. Every time I was called old enough, someone stepped back. Every time I was told I could handle it, help quietly disappeared. If I was upset, I was reminded that I was strong. If I needed support, I was told I was capable. If something felt heavy, it was reframed as a lesson. That's when I learned what that phrase really meant. You're grown wasn't encouragement. It was an exit. When adults believe you're resilient, they feel justified in leaving you alone with things that shouldn't be yours to carry yet. They mistake coping for comfort, adaptation for choice. I became self-sufficient early, not because I wanted independence, but because it was expected of me. I learned to manage my emotions quietly, to solve problems without asking, to shrink my needs so they wouldn't be inconvenient. People praise that. No one asked what it cost. The irony is that the stronger I appeared, the less protected I was. My ability to function became evidence that I didn't need backup. And the more I proved I could stand on my own, the more others felt free to walk away. That's the part we rarely talk about. Early independence is often treated like a badge of honor, but sometimes it's not a medal. It's a scar. Proof that support arrived late, or not at all. My dad understood that. He never confused my competence with invincibility. He didn't withdraw just because I was capable. He stayed consistent, present, grounded. My mom saw my independence differently. To her, it meant I didn't require as much attention, that I could absorb disappointment, that I would adjust. And I did. Until I realized that being able to handle it had quietly become my role in the family, the one who wouldn't make things difficult, the one who wouldn't ask for too much, the one who wouldn't need protecting. That framing followed me into adulthood, so when I was called independent again, years later, it didn't feel like a compliment. It felt familiar, familiar in the way that should make you pause. Because when people emphasize how capable you are right before asking you to sacrifice, that's not coincidence, it's strategy. They don't say, "We're stepping back." They say, "You've got this." They don't say, "We won't support you." They say, "You're strong." And if you've spent your life being rewarded for strength, it's easy to miss what's happening. Easy to believe that refusing feels like failure. That's why this part matters. Because self-reliance isn't always a choice. Sometimes it's a response to absence. And praise can be a convenient way to disguise withdrawal. Understanding that changed how I heard everything that came after. It changed how I interpreted concern, how I measured fairness, how I recognized pressure dressed up as respect. It also made one thing clear. Being capable does not mean being expendable. And just because you can carry something alone doesn't mean you should have to. That realization didn't come all at once. It came quietly, sitting in rooms where expectations were placed on me without being named, listening to compliments that felt heavier than criticism. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Because the moment someone calls you grown while asking you to give something up, that's not admiration, that's retreat. My dad died suddenly. No long illness, no time to prepare emotionally. One day he was there, quiet as always. And the next day, everything that had been stable went silent. The funeral was small, exactly how he would have wanted it. No speeches that tried to turn him into something he wasn't. No dramatic music, just a few people, a few chairs, and a lot of unspoken understanding. He lived his life without excess, and he left it the same way. What struck me most that day wasn't the grief, it was the order. Papers already arranged, instructions already written, bills already handled. Even in death, he had reduced chaos where he could. I stood there exhausted, numb, and strangely grateful, not just for what he left behind, but for what he didn't leave me to clean up. My mom arrived late. She looked exactly how she should have looked. Dressed right, eyes red at the right moments, voice soft when people were watching. She hugged me longer when others were nearby. People told me how strong she was, how heartbreaking it must be for her. I nodded. I didn't correct them. When the service ended and the crowd thinned, her tone changed. Not abruptly, just enough. She asked practical questions, quiet ones. How soon the estate would be settled, whether everything had already been filed, who I was working with, what the timeline looked like. No one else was around when she asked. There were no tears then, no pauses to breathe, just logistics. It was subtle, but once you notice it, you can't unnotice it. Some people grieve out loud, some people calculate in private. I went home that night to an empty house, opened the fridge, saw how little food was inside. I hadn't eaten all day, but I wasn't hungry. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the same notebook I'd been using for years. I wrote down what had happened, Not how I felt, just what was said. The questions, the order they came in, the absence of certain words. It felt colder than crying, but it felt clearer. A few days later, I met Rachel Nguyen. She didn't rush me. She didn't dramatize anything. She asked for documents and gave me time to find them. She read everything twice. That was the first moment I felt grounded again. She explained that my dad had prepared for this. Not just a will, but layers, clear boundaries. Instructions meant to prevent interference. Safeguards designed to hold even if emotions got loud. He hadn't been paranoid. He had been realistic. Listening to her walk through it all, I felt something shift. Grief didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It hardened into something steadier. I realized that my dad hadn't just left assets. He had left intention. And intention doesn't waver just because someone is gone. What bothered me most wasn't that my mom asked questions. It was when she asked them, and how, and what she didn't ask at all. She didn't ask how I was sleeping. She didn't ask if I was overwhelmed. She didn't ask what I needed. She asked what was happening next. That's when anger crept in. Quiet at first, then persistent. Loss doesn't turn people cruel. It just removes the buffer. It strips away the performance. Grief doesn't invent behavior. It reveals it. I started noticing patterns I'd ignored before. How concern showed up only when there was an audience. How urgency appeared only around paperwork. How affection softened whenever numbers were mentioned. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I watched. I listened. I wrote everything down. There's a strange moment after someone dies where you see people more clearly than you ever have. Not because you're wiser, because you're tired. Too tired to filter. You stop filling in the blanks for them. You stop assuming good intent where none is shown. That clarity doesn't feel powerful. It feels lonely, but it's honest, and honesty has weight. By the time the invitation to that meeting arrived, my sadness had already begun turning into something else. Not rage, not bitterness, resolve. I understood then that what was unfolding wasn't sudden. It wasn't caused by loss. It had always been there, waiting for a moment where it could move freely. My dad's absence didn't create greed. It just removed resistance. And once I saw that, I stopped asking why people were acting this way. I started asking what they thought they could get away with. That question mattered more, because grief passes, shock fades, but intentions don't change under pressure. They surface, and once surfaced, they don't go back in quietly. Paul Reynolds was the first one to speak. He didn't rush. He adjusted his chair, opened the folder in front of him, and started explaining things the way people do when they assume you don't know better. Calm voice, legal tone, no emotion. He said this wasn't about taking anything from me. It was about balance, about fairness, about making sure everyone felt included. Then he slid the document toward me. It was titled like something harmless, a family trust arrangement. He explained that the idea was simple. I would transfer 70% of what my dad left me into a trust. The trust would be managed for the benefit of my younger siblings. Long-term stability. Shared responsibility. He used the word temporary, even though nothing in the document was temporary. My mom nodded along while he talked, hands folded, face serious, like she was listening to a verdict she already agreed with. She didn't interrupt him. She waited until he finished, then leaned in slightly and said it was the right thing to do. That my dad would have wanted fairness. That this wasn't about money. It was about family. She said I shouldn't be selfish. She said I shouldn't embarrass anyone. She said I shouldn't make this harder than it needed to be. The language was soft, but the message wasn't. Sign, or be the problem. I didn't respond right away. I didn't argue. I didn't explain myself. I looked at the document, then I looked back at Paul, and I asked one question. What happens if I don't sign this? The room shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No one raised their voice, but something tightened. Paul paused longer than he had before. My mom stopped nodding. Paul cleared his throat and said we'd have to explore other options. He said it wouldn't be ideal. He said it could get complicated. He said things like court involvement and delays and unnecessary stress. He didn't say threat. He didn't need to. That's the thing about manipulation. It hates specifics. It survives on implication. So I stayed specific. What does complicated mean? I asked. Paul glanced at my mom before answering. He talked about legal costs, about credit issues, about how these things can affect people long-term, careers, reputations. My mom added that families remember things like this, that choices have consequences beyond paperwork. I wrote those words down. Every time they spoke, I wrote. I didn't tell them I was writing. I didn't warn them. I just did it. Dates, phrases, tone. They kept talking as if I would eventually break, as if the pressure would land. That's when it became clear. This wasn't a discussion. It was a test of compliance. And the truth they didn't want to say out loud was simple. My parents were divorced. That meant something very specific, something permanent. Divorce doesn't just end a marriage. It ends authority. It ends entitlement. It ends the right to speak on behalf of someone else's assets. My dad had built his life after that divorce. The money he earned after that point was his. And when he died, he left it to me, clearly, legally, without conditions. There was no moral argument that could change that. There was no emotional appeal that could override it. The only way they could get what they wanted was if I gave it up voluntarily, or if they scared me into thinking I had no other choice. That's why the trust was framed as generous. That's why the language was careful. That's why the word divorce was never mentioned. Because once you name that boundary, the entire story collapses. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't say what I knew yet. I just kept asking questions. Clear ones, concrete ones. Questions that required answers instead of feelings. And every time I did, the room grew quieter. Because manipulators can work around emotion. They can talk over pain. They can dismiss confusion. What they can't stand is clarity. Clarity removes their leverage. By the time the conversation stalled, I understood something important. This wasn't about honoring my father. It wasn't about fairness. And it definitely wasn't about family. It was about power. And power doesn't like to be reminded when it no longer exists. The meeting didn't end with shouting. It ended with tension, with unfinished sentences, with a realization that I wasn't going to make this easy. As I closed my notebook, I noticed something else. No one asked how I felt. They only asked what I would do. And that told me everything I needed to know about what this meeting was really for. The real consequences hadn't arrived yet. But they were already being implied. And I was done pretending not to hear them. I noticed it halfway through the conversation. Not the pressure. That was obvious. It was the wording. A sentence Paul used sounded too smooth, too familiar. Not something someone comes up with on the spot. It was polished in a way that suggested rehearsal. Then another phrase landed, and another. They weren't wrong. They were reused. I didn't react. I kept my face neutral. I flipped one page in my notebook like I always did when I needed time to think. That's when it clicked. I'd seen this language before, not in my own life, somewhere adjacent. A few years earlier, my dad had mentioned a distant relative, someone on his side of the family, not close, barely around, the kind of name you only hear at holidays. There had been a quiet falling out, no big argument, just distance. 1 year they stopped coming, then they stopped calling. Eventually, no one mentioned them at all. At the time, I hadn't asked questions. Families are good at closing ranks without explanation. But now, sitting in that room, with that document in front of me, the phrasing brought it back. Not as a memory, as a pattern. After the meeting paused, while Paul was checking something on his laptop and my mom was whispering to Mark, I sent a single text, just one sentence. Have you seen language like this before? Rachel replied almost immediately, yes. That was all she wrote. I didn't look up. I didn't change my posture. I kept listening as if nothing had happened. A few seconds later, another message came through. Different name, same structure, same trust language, same pressure points. I felt my stomach drop, but my hand stayed steady. Then the last message. They signed. Lost access. Family cut them off. That's when the room changed for me. Because a one-time bad decision is a mistake, but repetition is design. What I was sitting in wasn't a reaction to grief. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't desperation. It was a strategy. They had done this before. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me calm, clear in a way I hadn't felt all day. I looked around the table again, slowly, intentionally. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So many people, all aligned, all expecting the same outcome. That's when I understood why the setup felt so precise, why the paperwork was ready, why the tone shifted so quickly when I asked questions. They weren't improvising. They were repeating. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't reveal what I knew yet. I just stopped engaging emotionally. That's a subtle shift, but it's powerful. When you stop trying to be understood and start observing instead, people give themselves away. Paul continued explaining options. My mom talked about unity. Mark stayed quiet, eyes down, like someone who knew the script and didn't want to mess up his part. I kept writing. Not feelings. Facts. Because now, this wasn't a family issue. It was evidence. That's the thing about repeated behavior. It leaves a trail. And once you see the trail, you stop wondering if you're being unfair. You stop questioning your instincts. You start preparing. I sent one more message. Not long, just enough. I'm ready when you are. Rachel replied with a single word. Waiting. I closed my notebook. Then I said something simple. I need a moment. No one objected. No one could. That's another thing I've learned. People who rely on pressure don't know what to do with pauses. As I stood up, I counted again. Not under my breath. Out loud. They looked confused. I smiled. Not because I was confident. Because I was done pretending this was equal. I see a lot of people here. I said, I only brought one. That was the first time all afternoon that no one spoke. Because suddenly, the balance shifted. They thought numbers were power. They thought preparation was advantage. They thought repetition meant safety. They didn't realize I had already recognized the pattern. And once a pattern is named, it loses its teeth. What they didn't know was this. I wasn't alone because I brought backup. I wasn't alone because I brought clarity. And clarity is the one thing a strategy like this can't survive. Because when a tactic gets exposed, it stops being persuasive. It becomes what it always was. A plan. After that meeting failed, there was no apology, no follow-up call, no let's talk this through. What came instead was silence, followed by noise. I started hearing from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Short messages, awkward check-ins, questions that weren't really questions. They asked if I was okay. Then they asked if I was being reasonable. Then they stopped asking and started telling. They said I was cold. They said I cared more about money than people. They said grief changes people, and not always for the better. None of it was said to my face. It was said around me. That was when I realized the meeting wasn't the end. It was just the part where they tried guilt. And guilt didn't work. When guilt fails, people don't suddenly grow kinder. They look for another lever. A few days later, I got a notification on my phone while I was making coffee. A security alert from my financial portal. A login attempt I didn't recognize. Wrong device. Wrong location. Two-factor authentication triggered. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Not because I didn't understand what it meant, but because I didn't want to. I changed my passwords. Then I checked the activity log. There was another attempt from earlier that morning. Different IP. Same pattern. I felt something settle in my chest. Not fear. Clarity. That night, another alert came in, and then another. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't curiosity. It was persistence. I pulled out the notebook my dad taught me to keep. The one where I write things down instead of explaining them away. Dates, times, screenshots. I called Rachel the next morning. She didn't sound surprised. She didn't sound angry either. She asked me one question. Do you have logs? I told her yes. That's when she said something I haven't forgotten since. Tears don't create consequences. Evidence does. While emotions burn fast, data waits. It doesn't argue. It doesn't explain. It just sits there. That same week, the property manager forwarded me footage from the parking area near my place. A routine request. They said. I watched it alone on my laptop. Mark's car was parked for nearly an hour. The trunk open. A laptop balanced on the passenger seat. He didn't come inside. He didn't need to. Later that day, another clip came in. Different camera. Near the community office. Linda was there, standing near the mailboxes, looking around like she was waiting for something. The timestamps lined up better than I expected them to. When I overlaid the footage with the login attempts, the pattern stopped being abstract. It had shape. It had intention. This was the moment the story stopped being about family conflict and became a case. I didn't call them. I didn't warn them. I stopped trying to be understood. Instead, I documented. Every message that came through after that felt different, not heavier, just louder. The accusations kept coming, the explanations, the emotional language, but none of it mattered anymore. Because feelings don't override logs, narratives don't erase timestamps. People like to believe that if they cry hard enough, or explain long enough, the truth will soften. It doesn't. Truth doesn't respond to tone. It responds to proof. Rachel walked me through the next steps slowly. Freeze credit, preserve devices, no direct contact. Each step felt boring. Procedural, that was the point. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about creating consequences. I used to think standing up for yourself meant raising your voice or drawing a clear emotional line. I learned something different. When someone can't control you with guilt, they try control through access to your accounts, your reputation, your sense of safety. That's not drama. That's behavior. And behavior leaves traces. I didn't feel brave during any of this. I felt methodical. I slept with my phone on silent. I ate simple meals. I kept notes. And slowly, the noise stopped affecting me. Because once you stop asking to be treated fairly and start documenting what's happening, the balance shifts. Not loudly, not immediately, but permanently. The hardest part wasn't realizing what they were willing to do. It was accepting that nothing I felt could stop it. Only what I could prove. And once I understood that, I stopped crying. Not because it didn't hurt, but because tears were no longer useful. Evidence was. The moment everything lined up didn't come with shouting or relief. It came quietly, late at night, with my laptop open and my notebook beside it. I wasn't looking for a confession. I was looking for sequence. I laid everything out the way my dad taught me, not by emotion, by time. Mark's car entering the parking lot. The timestamp was clear. The camera angle wasn't dramatic, but it didn't need to be. Linda near the community mail area 20 minutes later. Different camera, different location, same afternoon. Then the login alerts, 2 attempts, same window of time. Individually, none of it meant much. People park cars, people check mail, systems glitch, but together, they formed a shape. That was the moment I stopped feeling overwhelmed and started feeling focused. I called Rachel, not to vent, not to ask what it meant. I just said, I think the timeline is complete. She asked me to walk her through it, slowly, minute by minute. As I spoke, I realized something strange. My voice didn't shake. My breathing didn't change. Because this wasn't personal anymore. This was structure. Rachel didn't interrupt. She waited until I finished, then said, Okay, here's what we do next. No drama, no reassurance, just steps. Preserve everything. Don't rename files. Don't edit screenshots. Keep originals. Backup data twice. Offline and cloud. Freeze credit. Notify institutions. Change authentication layers. No calls. No texts. No responses. Silence isn't weakness when it's strategic. I wrote it all down. Checklist style. There's something grounding about process. It gives your mind somewhere to stand when emotions are unstable. As I followed each step, the chaos lost momentum. Every action had a purpose. Every decision reduced exposure. And with each step, I understood something that feels obvious in hindsight. Modern self-defense doesn't look like confrontation. It looks like documentation. It looks like timestamps and logs and screenshots. It looks like not explaining yourself to people who already decided not to hear you. I didn't warn anyone that I was compiling evidence. I didn't threaten legal action. I didn't need to. Because when behavior leaves a trail, the trail speaks louder than words. There's a moment in situations like this where you're tempted to do something loud, to send a message, to confront, to demand an explanation. That impulse is understandable, but it's also exactly what derails clarity. Noise creates distraction. Distraction creates mistakes. So I stayed quiet. I kept building the timeline. Rachel helped me see what mattered and what didn't. What would hold up? What was just coincidence? We weren't trying to prove character. We were proving action. Intent isn't something you argue. It's something you demonstrate through sequence. And sequence doesn't lie. When the full timeline was complete, I looked at it for a long time, not because I was shocked, but because it explained everything. The pressure, the silence, the escalation. It wasn't emotional, it was tactical. That realization did something unexpected. It took the sting out of it. Because when harm is intentional, it stops feeling like rejection and starts feeling like risk management. You don't take it personally when a storm hits. You prepare. I asked myself a question I hadn't asked before. If this weren't my family, what would this be? The answer was simple: a coordinated attempt to gain access. Once I named it that way, my response became obvious. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need closure. I needed containment. Rachel filed the appropriate reports, not as accusations, as documentation. Facts don't need tone, they just need to be accurate. As the process moved forward, something else became clear. The people who had been loud grew quiet. The ones who had relied on implication stopped reaching out. Because implication only works when no one is keeping records. The aha moment wasn't dramatic. It wasn't satisfying in a cinematic way. It was stabilizing. Everything made sense once the timeline existed. Time, place, intent. Those three things are enough. And when they line up, you don't have to convince anyone of anything. You just let the truth move forward on its own. I didn't feel powerful in that moment. I felt prepared. And preparation, I learned, is a form of peace. Because when you stop reacting and start structuring, the situation stops controlling you. The facts take over. And facts don't care who raised you. The process didn't feel dramatic. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no moment where anyone suddenly confessed. It moved slowly, quietly, in steps. The evidence was presented the same way it had been collected, one piece at a time. Logs first, then camera footage, then the email patterns, then the message threads. Each item connected to the next without needing explanation. Linda said it was a misunderstanding. She said she was only trying to help me manage things. She said families don't need permission to support each other. She said everything had been taken out of context. Her tone stayed calm, almost wounded. Mark didn't say much at all. When he did, it was technical. He said systems glitch. He said devices get flagged incorrectly. He said nothing was intentional. No one mentioned the timeline. They didn't need to. Because data doesn't respond to emotion. The timestamps spoke for themselves. The access attempts lined up with the footage. The messages escalated after the meeting failed. The patterns repeated in a way that didn't leave room for coincidence. I sat there listening, not detached. Just steady. I wasn't trying to prove they were bad people. I was proving what they did. That distinction mattered. Every time the word family came up, it fell flat. Because family doesn't bypass security systems. Family doesn't test passwords. Family doesn't coordinate access. Those are choices, not feelings. The outcome wasn't cinematic. There was no moment of satisfaction, no apology, no recognition of harm. There were consequences instead. Financial penalties, significant ones. Legal fees reimbursed in full, formal findings entered into record. And then the part people rarely talk about, restrictions. No contact orders, mandatory monitoring, professional disclosures. Mark's work was affected almost immediately. Projects paused, trust questioned, access reduced. The kind of damage that doesn't show up on a headline but follows you quietly. Linda lost something else. Access. Not just to me, but to influence, to narrative, to control. That loss was permanent. What surprised me wasn't how harsh it felt. It was how proportional it was. There was no vengeance in it, just containment. I learned then that real-world justice isn't loud. It doesn't make speeches. It doesn't humiliate. It limits. It removes options. It closes doors. It creates boundaries that don't move when emotions rise. The hardest part wasn't watching the consequences land. It was accepting that they didn't need to be dramatic to be severe. Because the heaviest punishment wasn't money. It wasn't public shame. It wasn't even the legal record. It was supervision, being watched, being restricted, knowing that every action from that point forward would be logged. That kind of accountability lasts. I walked out of the final meeting alone, not isolated, just unaccompanied. The air felt different, not lighter, clearer. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I had to defend my reality. I didn't need to explain anything. I didn't need to be understood. The process had done that for me. I went home, opened the door, put my keys down, sat at the kitchen table I'd been using all along, same notebook, same pen. I wrote one sentence: consequences don't argue. That's what stayed with me. Justice didn't restore anything that was lost emotionally. It didn't repair the relationship. It didn't create closure. What it did was stop the behavior. And sometimes, that's enough. If you've ever waited for someone to admit they hurt you, you know how rare that is. If you've ever hoped consequences would come with remorse, you know how often they don't. Real justice doesn't require understanding. It requires boundaries that hold. Looking back, I don't think they expected this outcome. They expected noise. They expected negotiation. They expected guilt. They didn't expect documentation. They didn't expect silence followed by structure. They didn't expect me to step out of the emotional frame entirely. That's the part that changed everything. I didn't win by convincing anyone. I didn't win by being louder. I didn't win by proving moral superiority. I won by letting the facts do their job. And the job they did was simple. They created consequences that lasted longer than any argument ever could. That's what real-world justice looks like. Quiet, procedural, unavoidable. And once it arrives, it doesn't need to be explained again. When everything was finally over, I went back to the house near the highway. The same one-story place, same quiet mornings, same kitchen table. Nothing about it looked different, but the air felt lighter. Not happy, just calm. I put my keys down. I took my shoes off. I stood there for a moment longer than usual, listening to the silence. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt settled. I opened the fridge and noticed how little was inside. A few leftovers, water, nothing special. I wasn't hungry. I sat down anyway. That's when it hit me. What my dad left me wasn't just money. It was a way of living. He left me habits. The kind that don't look impressive from the outside. Writing things down, pausing before responding, asking clear questions, knowing when to stop explaining. He left me boundaries that didn't require permission. For a long time, I thought standing up for myself meant being loud, or convincing, or finally finding the right words that would make people understand. I was wrong. I didn't win because I spoke better. I didn't win because I argued harder. I won because I stopped arguing at all. I trusted what felt wrong before I could prove it, and then I gave myself time to prove it. If you're listening to this, and something in your chest feels tight, this part is for you. If you've ever been invited into a room where everyone seems calm, but your body isn't. If you've ever been told it's just a conversation, but it feels like a test. If you've ever been called difficult for asking basic questions, you're not imagining it. That uneasy feeling isn't drama, it's information. You don't need to explain it to anyone to honor it. If a meeting requires you to prepare emotionally, it's already unequal. If a conversation makes you afraid to pause, it's already unsafe. If saying no feels like betrayal, the terms were never fair. I wish someone had told me this earlier. You are not selfish for setting boundaries. You are not ungrateful for saying no. You are not cold for protecting yourself. And you don't owe anyone access to your life just because you share a last name. If you're in the middle of your own version of that room, here's what I learned the hard way. Slow down. Write things down. Pay attention to tone, not promises. If you feel pressured to decide quickly, don't. If you're told to keep things in the family, ask why transparency is being discouraged. If you're asked to sacrifice without clarity, stop. Bring a third party, not someone emotional, someone grounded, someone who doesn't get pulled into guilt. You don't need backup because you're weak. You need perspective because pressure distorts reality. And please hear this. You don't have to win by raising your voice. You don't have to convince anyone you're right. You just have to stop participating in something that costs you your peace. Truth doesn't need volume. It needs records. I know it's tempting to hope people will change once they see how hurt you are. I hope that too. But feelings don't create accountability. Patterns do. When you stop reacting and start documenting, the dynamic shifts, quietly, permanently. The hardest part isn't setting the boundary. It's accepting what setting it reveals. Sometimes the cost of self-respect is distance. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's letting go of the version of family you wished you had. That doesn't mean you failed. It means you chose yourself. I don't feel victorious telling this story. I feel steady, and that's more valuable. If you're watching this and you're still inside that room, still wondering if you're overreacting, still trying to find the right way to explain yourself, pause. Ask yourself one simple question. If this weren't my family, would this be acceptable? Your answer matters. And whatever you decide next, remember this. You don't need to be louder. You don't need to be cruel. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be honest with yourself. Because the moment you start trusting what you see instead of what you're told to feel, you're no longer trapped. You're already on your way out. And if this story helped you feel less alone, less crazy, or more certain about something you've been carrying quietly, then share it with someone who needs it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone know they're not wrong for wanting safety, and that choosing peace is not abandonment, it's inheritance.